Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to this week's episode of British Culture, Albion Never Dies. S is for, well, several splendid suggestions, but okay, Secret Service should surely be the headline. Of course, episode 103, S is for Sports, Scotland, and SAS and SBS is already out, and I had some wonderful emails and messages all about it. Thank you very much. And also the same for episode 104. S is for Simon Templar, aka the Saint. So I'm carrying on throughout this month with the letter S. I've had some fantastic suggestions, so just thought I'd say at the top of the episode, thank you to everyone who's been messaging me, emailing, commenting, however you've got in touch. I really appreciate it. Of course, some people have subscribed to the newsletter, and that core group of listeners are, of course, in a monthly draw. So Matthew Spencer, hello. You have received your A is for Albion mug, and that's just for being a subscriber to the newsletter. Matthew lives all the way out in South Korea, so this is a truly international podcast. We do have listeners all over the world, and it's a great joy to receive messages from them. So as I send out a newsletter about once a month, and at the moment there are 31 subscribers, so plenty of opportunities to win in the lucky draw. This month I asked a random number generator to generate a number randomly between 1 and 31, and it gave me 21. The 21st person to subscribe to my newsletter wins a prize, and that person is Joan Harris. So congratulations. Please accept an email from me very soon so I can send you a Sears for Crumpets fridge magnet, or a mug if you prefer. So one more prize going out, and that's just to anyone who subscribes to the newsletter. You can subscribe by clicking the link in the podcast descriptor, or by emailing me at albionneverdies@gmail.com, or by messaging me on Instagram. However you normally get in touch with me, just do so. And if you'd like to receive the newsletter, which is often just a personal roundup of what's going on behind this podcast, or occasionally if I've appeared on another podcast, then I kind of drop it there. So if you'd like a bit more contact, in case there's something you've missed, subscribe to the newsletter, and you too could win a prize, like Matthew and Joan. So this week, S is for several splendid things. Where I live in West Yorkshire, it was snowing today. We had quite the snow flurry, and it has settled, so it survived the day. But I can't talk about that as a uniquely British thing, especially when there are so many listeners in Canada, including Simon Sartorially, an Instagram account all about fine clothes. The gentleman there, Simon, messaged me and suggested that S should be for Shires, and indeed the Shire. So first of all, a Shire in Great Britain is essentially a county. I had a look at the great description in the Encyclopaedia Britannica. The Anglo-Saxon Shire, Old English Skier, was an administrative division next above the 100, and seems to have existed in the south in the time of Alfred the Great. So that's from AD 871 to AD 899. It seems to have been fully established by the reign of Edgar in the 10th century. It was administered by an ealdorman, or alderman, and by a sheriff, or a shire reeve. It evolved into the word sheriff later, who presided over the shire court. After the Norman conquest, the French term county was introduced and generally supplanted shire in preferred official use, although shire continued in popular use, and frequently even in official records, and lasted in many county names such as Cheshire, Hampshire, and Warwickshire. The root shire is still also adjoined to the names of smaller communities, such as the parish of Hexhamshire. Of course, when I pronounce it at the end of a word, it's always shire, not Shire, and I know that this comes up when Americans try and pronounce Worcestershire sauce. It's said to be one of the hardest things to pronounce in the English language, but relatively easy, of course, if you've lived there, as I have. And I mention Worcestershire because, of course, the Shire was mentioned by Simon Sartorially, and the Shire in The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and Middle-earth is often thought to have been modelled on the West Midlands, especially Worcestershire. Many of the descriptions of the Shire match closely to areas around the Malvern Hills. It is a place rich in history. For example, on the Malvern Hills, there's one hill which has kind of an ancient fort. I didn't even look that one up, but what I did is I went back to my various copies of The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was, of course, a scholar of Anglo-Saxon literature and used much of their kind of orderings when setting out how Middle-earth was run and governed. So I really thought I'd go to the prologue of The Lord of the Rings, section 3 of the prologue, which is of the ordering of the Shire, and just have a quick look at what is a Shire in Tolkien's world. He writes, "The Shire was originally divided into 4 quarters, the Farthings, already referred to, north, south, east and west, and these again into a number of folklands, which still bore the names of some of the old leading families, although by the time of this history these names were no longer found only in their proper folklands. Nearly all Took still lived in a Tookland, but that was not true of many other families such as the Bagginses or the Boffins. Outside the Farthings were the East and West Marches, the Buckland and the West March added to the Shire in SR 1452. I'm going to say more about ways of counting years later. SR is, of course, Shire reckoning. The Shire at this time had hardly any, quote, government, unquote. Families, for the most part, managed their own affairs. Growing food and eating it occupied most of their time. In other matters they were, as a rule, generous and not greedy, but contented and moderate, so that estates, farms, workshops and small trades tended to remain unchanged for generations. There remained, of course, the ancient tradition concerning the High King at Fornost, or Norbury as they called it, away north of the Shire. There had been no king for nearly 1,000 years, and even the ruins of the King's Norbury were covered with grass. Yet the Hobbit still said of wild folk and wicked things, such as trolls, that they had not heard of the king. For they attributed to the king of old all their essential laws, and usually they kept the laws of free will, because they were the rules, as they said, both ancient and just. It is true that the Took family had long been preeminent, for the office of Thrain had passed to them from the Old Bucks some centuries before, and the chief Took had borne that title ever since. The Thrain was the master of the Shire Moot, and captain of the Shire Muster and the Hobbitry in arms, but as muster and moot were only held in times of emergency, which no longer occurred, the Thrainship had ceased to be more than a nominal dignitary. The Took family was still indeed accorded a special respect, for it remained both numerous and exceedingly wealthy, and was liable to produce in every generation strong characters of peculiar habits and even adventurous temperament. The latter qualities, however, were now rather tolerated in the rich than generally approved. The custom endured, nonetheless, of referring to the head of the family as the Took, and adding to his name if required a number, such as Isengrim II. The only real office in the Shire at this date was the Mayor of Michael Delving of the Shire, who was elected every 7 years at the Free Fair on the White Downs at the Lythe. That is, at midsummer. As Mayor, almost his only duty was to preside at banquets given on the Shire holidays, which occurred at frequent intervals, but the offices of Postmaster and First Sheriff were attached to the mayoralty, so that he managed both the message service and the watch. I shall pause there. I know that not everyone is a fan of The Lord of the Rings, as I am. I've even been having some messages about that lately, but I think it's wonderful to go through The Lord of the Rings, compare it to Anglo-Saxon history, especially to Alfred the Great and the kings that followed, because of course that's what Tolkien himself studied, and much of what he wrote was an imagining of how Anglo-Saxon literature would have continued had it not been for the Norman conquest in 1066. In many ways it's an alternative timeline, filled of course with magic and wonder. I very much enjoy it, and I think it gives a great insight into the Anglo-Saxon shires and how they thought of themselves and how they portrayed themselves in literature. Okay, I shall move on to another S, as there are many to get through. S, suggested Simon sartorially. S is for Stonehenge. So, I started to look into this, and it's the oldest part of the Stonehenge monument. Was built during the period from 3000 to 2935 BCE. Now, that first thing set me off on a inadvertent rabbit hole. Stonehenge, I feel you know what it is. It's in the south of England. It's a pile of rocks piled on top of each other in extraordinary and interesting ways that line up in ways that of great interest to many, many archaeologists and conspiracy theorists. Some people have suggested it was the first football stadium. I quite like that idea, but I got very, very distracted by BCE. Of course, I've been away from the Western world for 7 years. I haven't really come across this term BCE. I've seen it, but I had the time to look into it, so I did. And I found a wonderful article all about BCE and CE and what it means and why. Reading from the article, I found the movement towards BCE and CE has not been universally accepted, and BC-AD is still more widely used, even though BCE and CE has been used in the mainstream since the 1980s. Just myself, I'm very glad they both refer to the same dates. Anyway, the article continues. There have been backlashes to the adoption of the new system in defence of BC AD, and notably in 2002 when the UK national curriculum made the transition. So school kids are using this longer initial. In 2011, education authorities in Australia were forced to deny that such a change had been planned for national school textbooks amid similar controversy triggered by media reports. So the UK is going one way, Australia is going the other, the more traditional way. Passions are usually highest among those who see the adoption of the new system as an attempt to write Jesus Christ out of history. They argue that the entire Gregorian calendar is Christian in nature anyway, so why should we attempt to obscure the fact? Others ask why such a well-established and functional system should be replaced, arguing that the existence of two competing abbreviations is likely to cause confusion. Indeed. It has also been argued that BCE and CE is in fact less religiously inclusive than BC-AD. According to some, BCE-CE elevates the importance of Christ's birth to the start of an entirely new common era, before Common Era and Common Era are BCE-CE, while BC-AD is a simple reference to the event. I do think that's really interesting. You're just assuming that it's a common era of all people on Earth. Of course, I worked in Saudi Arabia, where it is currently the year 1444. BH, before the Hijrah. That's the Islamic calendar, and it's widely used in Saudi Arabia. They don't use the Christian era or the common era and so on. They do use this common era in China, so there it might be an appropriate term. And of course in Turkey they use just the year as the year. But you do come across the Islamic calendar sometimes in Turkish writing, but I say in Saudi, that was just it. It's the year 1444 this year. So it's not universally accepted by all people around the world. Anyway, I got completely distracted by that and didn't look so much into Stonehenge. So my apologies to Simon for that. I did look into Simon as an English name. I started to look into Simon de Montfort, who of course is essential to the story of Edward I, and Edward I, his story, is essential to the story of Braveheart, which I covered in the S is for Scotland episode. The full story that I really enjoy is in Simon Sharma's A History of England, and that TV show is still available on the BBC iPlayer. It's free to watch, which is great. And then there's a book by Marc Morris called A Great and Terrible King, Edward I and the Forging of Britain, which is, I find it fascinating. In an astonishingly action-packed life, Edward defeated and killed the famous Simon de Montfort in battle, travelled to the Holy Land on crusade, conquered Wales, extinguishing forever its native rulers, and constructed at Conway, Harlech, Beaumaris, and Carnarvon the most magnificent chain of castles ever created. After the death of his first wife, he created the Eleanor Crosses, the grandest funeral monuments ever fashioned for an English monarch. Anyway, S could be for Simon de Montfort, and of course I couldn't resist googling, who's the most famous Simon in the world, and apparently it is Simon Cowell, so another British Simon. Okay, I said at the beginning I might do Secret Service, and that suggestion was from Daniel Gaster. In part 1 I talked about Sir Neville Francis Fitzgerald Chamberlain, and he was of course an old Indian Army officer who went into intelligence, drawing on his experience in India and Afghanistan, not to mention East Asia, for burgeoning British intelligence. These days we have the SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, who on their website talk about how for over 100 years the SAS has ensured the UK and our allies keep one step ahead of our adversaries. We are creative and determined, using cutting-edge technology and espionage. They further state we have 3 core aims: stopping terrorism, disrupting the activity of hostile states, and giving the UK a cyber advantage. We work closely with MI5, GCHQ, HM Armed Forces, law enforcement, and a range of other international partners. Everything we do is tasked and authorised by senior government ministers and overseen by Parliament and independent judges. People who work for MI6 come from all walks of life, with different skills, interests, and backgrounds. I think anybody who's listened to this podcast will know that here is a perfect opportunity to tie it into the Secret Service, the Special Operations Executive of Ian Fleming, and this is where I got drawn into various books. For example, Ben MacIntyre, the historian who wrote Operation Mincemeat, which was recently adapted into a movie with Colin Firth and portrays a young Ian Fleming working for naval intelligence, and also wrote the book For Your Eyes Only, Ian Fleming and James Bond, which sets out the connection between Ian Fleming in the Second World War and the Special Operations Executive that existed to try and harass the Germans in their occupation as much as possible. Tony Jutt's book, Post-War, gives a bit of an insight into this in the early chapters, which of course I reviewed for my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/British Culture. But going to the Ben MacIntyre book on Ian Fleming, it talks about how, in the smoky hive of room 39, Fleming was Godfrey's frontman, Godfrey the head of naval intelligence, and as such he operated with considerable freedom. He liaised with MI6 and SOE, responsible for sabotage and subversion. He worked with the political warfare executive on propaganda and handled the press. He fielded demands for information from above and shielded Godfrey from interference from below. I shared all the secrets with him, Godfrey later wrote. Fleming was also allowed to evolve and manage his own plots, or plans. The choice of word given his later career as a novelist seems significant. Some of Fleming's ideas were run-of-the-mill, some were fantastical and impractical, and some, in the opinion of his colleagues, were simply mad. Even Godfrey noted that Fleming tended not to let practicalities get in the way of a good plot. He had plenty of ideas and was anxious to carry them out, but was not interested in, and would prefer to ignore, the extent of the logistics background inseparable to all projects. In a sense, Fleming's task was to dream up espionage plans with convincing scenarios. Others would then be charged with trying to turn fiction into reality, and this he was preparing for and precisely reversing the process that would lead to the creation of James Bond. Among Fleming's more remarkable ideas were scuttling cement barges in the Danube at its most narrow point in order to block the waterway for German shipping, forging Reichsmarks to disrupt the German economy, dropping an observer, possibly Fleming himself, on the island of Heligoland to monitor the shipping outside Kiel, and sinking a lump of concrete off Dieppe with men inside it to observe the German coastal defences. They may have seemed nonsensical in retrospect, but at the time they were matters of life and death, and Ian treated his new job with a dedication he had never shown before, starting work at 6 a.m. and continuing late into the night. Of course, that book by Ben MacIntyre is an overall look at wartime intelligence in Fleming's place in it and how it connects to James Bond. There's a special one by Nicholas Rankin called Ian Fleming's Commandos, the story of 30 Assault Unit in World War II. I've really been enjoying this. I picked it up just in the last few days, so I've been going through it, and it's all about a specialised unit created essentially to go into conflict areas and get as much useful intelligence and bring it home as swiftly as possible. So Nicholas Rankin's Ian Fleming's Commandos, I'm going through it. I might have to review it later on some channel or another. And I was helped by a friend pointed out a book in a bookshop called Ian Fleming and SOE's Operation Postmaster. That's by Brian Lett. And again, this is all about Ian Fleming's involvement with these various intelligence organisations, and coming across a fella in the SOE who signed his letters M. So whilst M is very definitely based on the head of naval intelligence, it seems that various codes used were taken from the SOE. In fact, I'd always assumed that the MI6, the Secret Service in Ian Fleming's novels, is very much drawn from the Special Operations Executive, as if it had carried on into peacetime. The war had carried on and on. But that is something that's much debated among historians. I think Brian Lett, the author of Ian Fleming and SOE, goes down on the SOE route, whilst, of course, Ben MacIntyre goes down more along the naval route. Anyway, Ian Fleming's creation is all fantasy, but it is interesting to look at the wartime origins of these daydreams, these fantasies. Okay, I shall move away from the war history to a suggestion that S in the alphabet of Britishness stands for Stoicism and stiff upper lip. That came from the Instagram account X007RJP, and also on Facebook, from a Facebook group, Britain, People, Places and Pastimes. A gentleman named Martin, a lady named Janet. Again, I don't read out full names from Facebook, just because people often have that as their private thing, and they're not looking for people to follow them. I simply looked up on Wikipedia. I thought, I've got all these serious history books around me. Why don't I just use the Wikipedia and see what that says? So they say the idea of the stiff upper lip is traced back to ancient Greece, to the Spartans, whose cult of discipline and self-sacrifice were the source of inspiration to the English public school system and to the Stoics. Stoic ideas were adopted by the Romans, particularly the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who wrote, "If you are distressed by any external thing, it is not this thing which disturbs you, but your own judgment about it, and it is in your power to wipe out that judgment now." The concept reached England in the 1590s, not 1950s, the 1590s, and featured in the plays of William Shakespeare. His tragic hero Hamlet says, "There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." Poems that feature a memorable evocation of Victorian Stoicism and a stiff upper lip include Rudyard Kipling's If and W.E. Henley's Invictus. W.E. Henley wrote some fantastic books, not so popular now, but happily available on Kindle. Anyway, the phrase became symbolic of the British people, and particularly of those who were students of the English public school system during the Victorian era. Such schools were heavily influenced by Stoicism and aimed to instill a code of discipline and devotion to duty in their pupils through character-building competitive sports, as immortalised in the poem Vitae Lampada, and corporal punishments and cold showers. So, I was amused that's how the paragraph ended. Anyway, stiff upper lip does seem to be something commonly identified with the UK. Moving on to another thing commonly associated with the UK, Izzy Reddy. That's his Instagram name. He suggested S is for savage. Haha, kidding. The title, Sir. So, first of all, just had a look at, the Order of the Garter, founded in 1348 and still going. In medieval times, King Edward III was so inspired by tales of King Arthur and the chivalry of the Knights of the Round Table that he set up his own group of honourable knights called the Order of the Garter. Nearly 700 years later, the Order is the oldest and most senior order of chivalry in Britain. The knights, now both male and female, used to be limited to aristocracy, but today they are chosen from a variety of backgrounds in recognition for their public service. Today, the order includes the King, who is sovereign of the Garter, several members of the royal family, and 24 knights chosen in recognition of their work. Knights of the Garter are chosen personally by the sovereign to honour those who have held public office, who have contributed in a particular way to national life, or who have served the sovereign personally. These have included Marshal of the RAF, Lord Stirrup, and former Prime Ministers Sir John Major and Sir Winston Churchill. The patron saint of the order is St. George, patron saint of soldiers and also of England, and if there are vacancies in the order, appointments are announced on St. George's Day, 23rd of April. Well, the next suggestion was from my friend on Instagram, Mr. Two Green Thumbs, as if it was a zombie playing video games. He is, dare I say it, not a James Bond fan. But the first thing that came into his mind was Scaramanga, Francisco Scaramanga, the man with the golden gun. Ian Fleming perhaps named him after George Scaramanga, with whom Ian Fleming had a number of schoolboy fights. And reportedly, there was another member of the Scaramanga family who had fights with Ian Fleming's nephew. So the fact that there was a multi-generational feud going on may well have led to the final novel, the final full-length novel from Ian Fleming, starring a brutal man named Scaramanga. He doesn't resemble too much the Christopher Lee character from the 1974 film, except perhaps in his height. I'm reading from this Francisco Paco Pistols Scaramanga. I quite like that. The film could have gone with Paco Pistols or Pistols Paco, but went with Francisco Scaramanga instead. In the novel, M reads a file, and part of it has been written by Sir James, a psychologist who occasionally helps out the Secret Service. The psychologist has written time notes, but does not comment upon the fact that this man cannot whistle. Now, it may only be myth, and it is certainly not medical science, but there is a popular theory that a man who cannot whistle has homosexual tendencies. At this point, the reader may care to experiment, and from his self-knowledge, help prove or disprove this item of folklore. M hadn't whistled since he was a boy. Unconsciously, his mouth pursed and a clear note was emitted. He uttered an impatient "ta" and continued with his reading. This actually got onto an episode of QI where they claimed that Ian Fleming believed that homosexuals could not whistle, which, given Ian Fleming's social circle, seems a pretty unlikely belief for him to hold. Anyway, not to give too many spoilers, but somewhere in the Bond series, Bond reads a cable from M, deciphered by a lovely lady, and is offered a knighthood, a KCMG. Bond already has his CMG for services past and present to Britain, but he turns it down because of his love of anonymity. So, this immediately begs the question, what is a CMG? Well, it's the most distinguished order of St. Michael and St. George, the British Order of Knighthood, founded in 1818 by the Prince Regent, later King George IV, to commemorate the British protectorate over the Ionian Islands, now in Greece, and Malta, which came under British rule in 1814. Originally, membership was exclusively for inhabitants of the Ionian Islands and Malta, as well as for British citizens who had performed important government services in the Mediterranean area. Since 1879, any citizen of the United Kingdom has been eligible. However, the honour is conferred mostly on officials in colonial affairs, foreign service officers and diplomats and others who have performed important duties in Commonwealth countries. Foreigners may be admitted as honorary members. This, of course, is referenced in the 1980s sitcom Yes, Minister. In the second series, the episode is Doing the Honours, and it's all about, well, the honours system. I'm just having a look through the book I have. Yes, in the FCO, the honours are the Cross of St. Michael and St. George, CMG, KCMG and GCMG. The Foreign Office is not popular throughout the rest of the civil service, and is widely held that the CMG stands for Call Me God, the KCMG for Kindly Call Me God, and the GCMG for God Calls Me God. Well, there we go. I do love a bit of Yes Minister, a grand bit of British satire. And satire was indeed suggested, along with sarcasm, by several friends on Facebook, particularly Sue, who suggested that sarcasm should be a topic covered. But I think I might need to do another special episode on this. S is for satire, quite possibly. S, of course, is for sandwiches. Fans of the movie Moonraker will remember what an important thing a cucumber sandwich can be. Allegedly, the sandwich was invented in 1762. John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, invented the meal that changed dining forever. The story goes that he was playing cards and did not want to leave the gaming table to eat. He asked for a serving of roast beef to be placed between 2 slices of bread so he could eat it with his hands. However, Sandwich's biographer, N.A.M. Roger, suggests Sandwich's commitments to the Navy and to politics and the arts means that the first sandwich was more likely to have been consumed at his desk. I found it really interesting. The first written usage of the English word appeared in Edward Gibbons's journal in 1762, as according to the Oxford English Dictionary. So he hasn't just written the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, he has given us the written evidence of the word sandwich. And there is indeed a special magazine, Sandwich and Food to Go News, all about sandwiches and presumably food to go, for the Sandwich and Food to Go Association. I feel this is something that would appear in the British satirical show Have I Got News for You? Mick and Martin on Facebook suggested S is for sausage rolls, and Nick and Debbie suggested that it was for a British food spelt S-C-O-N-E-S, and there are many debates about how to pronounce that word. I find it really interesting that it doesn't seem to depend on class, and it doesn't seem to depend on geography. There's just many different ways to say it. Is it scone, or is it scone? Is it scone, or is it scone? And there's all kinds of debates about whether it's jam and then cream and then jam, and goodness knows. But if you enjoy eating them, enjoy it. Oh, I said I had a few different books for this episode, and On Her Majesty's Secret Service gives us the Bondian moment of James Bond at the seaside, because S is for seaside, according to the Instagram account, Bondian moments. So, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, it's from chapter 1, Seascape with Figures. And since it's from chapter 1, it's no real spoiler. Let's have a look at this. To James Bond, sitting in one of the concrete shelters with his face to the sun, there was something poignant, ephemeral about it all. It reminded him almost too vividly of childhood, of the velvet feel of the hot powder sand and the painful grit of wet sand between young toes when the time came for him to put his shoes on, of the precious little pile of seashells, an interesting rack on his sill of his bedroom window. "No! We'll have to leave that behind, darling. It'll dirty up your trunk." Of the small crabs scuttling away from the nervous fingers, groping beneath the seaweed in the rock pools, of the swimming and swimming and swimming through the dancing waves, always in those days, it seemed, lit with sunshine, and then the infuriating, inevitable time to come out. It was all there, his own childhood, spread out before him to have another look at. What a long time ago they were, those spade and bucket days. How far he had come since the freckles and their Cadbury milk chocolate flakes and the fizzy lemonade. Impatiently, Bond lit a cigarette, pulled his shoulders out of their slouch, and slammed the mawkish memories back into their long-closed file. Today he was a grown-up, a man with years of dirty, dangerous memories, a spy. He was not sitting in this concrete hideout to sentimentalize about a pack of scrubby-smelling children on a beach scattered with bottle tops and lolly sticks, and fringed by a sea thick with sun oil and putrid with the main drains of Royale. He was here, and he had chosen to be here, to spy on a woman. Wow, that section of Ian Fleming's On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Many people love the film, but for me the book gets me more than the film. Anyway, on Instagram again, Fifth Chamber suggested S is for sartorial elegance, and the Facebook group moderator Yvonne suggested that S is for Sandringham. Sandringham is the much-loved country retreat of the British royal family and has been the private home to generations of British monarchs since 1862. In 1977, to mark her silver jubilee, the Queen opened the house and grounds to the public for the first time. You can explore Sandringham Royal Parkland by foot or bike or with a furry friend. It's good for dog walking. The 600-acre Royal Parkland has 2 waymarked trails winding through the woodlands and parkland with further unmarked paths for you to explore. It's in Norfolk, and it's one of the royal residences of Charles III, whose grandfather, George VI, and great-grandfather, George V, both died there. Fun fact. Anyway, it's a beautiful palace and has beautiful grounds. Anyway, Moving on to the next few suggestions, Joseph Space Ranger on Instagram suggested S is for SPECTRE, of course the 2015 movie and the organisation first referenced in the novel Thunderball 1961 and introduced in the films with From Russia with Love 2 years later, 1963, although they both claim that Dr. No was an operative. The Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge and Extortion, that's what SPECTRE stands for, allegedly. So, the next one is Sky, or Kath on Facebook, suggested the ever-changing colours that you don't get abroad. I do find that very true. When I came back to the UK the first time after 7 years in Turkish Cyprus, where the skies always looked like Renaissance paintings, the skies in England looked like a Constable painting. It wasn't covered in my sea episode, so I might have to go back to that. That was my penultimate suggestion. The final one is from Sifu Lamus, who suggested, I think it's pronounced Susie, and the Banshees, a 70s rock band. I'm not going to play music on the podcast unless I own it, unless I've created it. So I shall leave that one aside. And of course there is Simon Templar, but that was my last. So yeah, many suggestions for S, and I think we might have time for just one more episode on S before we move to T. If you have a suggestion for T, please do email me at albionneverdies, or you can contact me on Instagram at Fleming Never Dies. Thank you very much for listening. Until next time.